Hey, welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that have built these times. We're continuing our story today, The Empire, a 250-year American story. And in our last couple of episodes, we've been moving ever closer to the age of independence in the American colonies. In fact, in the last episode, as we closed, the British were occupying Boston. The Boston Massacre had occurred, and we also had the Boston Tea Party. So this irreparable crack was forming between the colonists and their British rulers. In this episode today, we finally turn to independence, and we finally lock in for the decisions that could only result in revolution. Now, if you haven't been to the website yet, theendofhistory.net, be sure to check out the various posts and articles that support and really even give more background to the stories that I'm telling in this podcast, in this series. You might also bookmark another series you want to listen to when you're done with this one. For now, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode and the story of American independence.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So the calling of the First Continental Congress is what, in retrospect, really set things forward, set things toward independence, where after this it was impossible to turn back. Even at this point in the game, few people in America, except the most radical, I guess, were really thinking of independence. They were trying to find a way of resolving this situation between the colonies and the homeland, the mother country, Britain, resolving the situation so that it wouldn't come to a call for independence, really. Building on the delicate architecture of the committees of correspondence that we've looked at in a prior episode, energized by the Sons of Liberty, representatives were sent from all of the colonies, with the exception of Georgia. Georgia would join later on. They met in Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies, by 1774. The whole endeavor was really being done on the fly. I mean, they were quite literally making it up as they went along. When the delegates arrived at Carpenter's Hall there in Philadelphia, they faced immediate questions. How should voting work? Should larger colonies have more influence? In a symbolic gesture of unity, they adopted the principle of one colony, one vote, regardless of population. Leadership was informal, but it was also influential. Peyton Randolph of Virginia was chosen as president. Figures like Samuel Adams, John Adams, Patrick Henry, John Jay, George Washington, they shaped the debate behind the scenes. Samuel Adams and John Adams actually went out of their way to make sure they didn't appear to be making things happen in their own right. The other delegates were kind of suspicious of the Adams's radicalism, these guys from Boston, and if they overplayed their hands, if they pushed too hard, then the whole effort could fall apart. John Adams already believed he was living in historical times, though. He had actually asked his wife, Abigail, to save all their correspondence that they were sending back and forth to one another, because he was rightly believing their letters would become historical documents. And if you've ever read any books on John Adams, Abigail Adams, on their correspondence, he's absolutely right. Fascinating letters when you dig into that. If you've also seen the movie based off of the David McCullough book, John Adams, it's an HBO movie. That's a good one to see. A little difficult to get over the dental work in the costume, but great movie, great miniseries. The Congress conducted its business through committees, long debates, carefully drafted resolutions, and delegates, they were disagreeing sharply. All right. Some wanted reconciliation. Others believed a conflict with Britain was inevitable, but they shared a commitment to collective action. If they were all going to have to do it together, whatever direction this went, they had to do it together. The historian Alan Taylor, he wrote about the meetings. He wrote, endowed with robust egos, most wanted to show off rather than defer in this conclave of talents. John Adams said the same thing. He wrote in his journal during the First Continental Congress, he said, the deliberations of the Congress are spun out to an immeasurable length. There is so much wit, sense, learning, acuteness, subtlety, eloquence, etc. among 50 gentlemen, each of whom has been habituated to lead and guide in his own province, that an immensity of time is spent unnecessarily. In other words, everyone was trying to out-important the other. So by the end, there was really, by the end of this first meeting, there were really only a few things agreed upon. One, they would all unite in a colony-wide boycott of British goods. So they drafted a declaration of rights and grievances that was sent to the King of England. He wouldn't even read it, as it turned out. But not yet knowing how the king was going to respond, they agreed they would reconvene once the British response to their pressure could be measured, could be considered. Now, just as significant to all of this, but little understood today, when we consider our mythology of American independence and the Revolution, was the development of the Continental Association. Now, early in the series, I asked, why did people ask, or a few episodes back, I asked, why did people agree to abide by what Congress did or said? What made them credible? What made them legitimate? Well, this right here is the answer, and it's a surprising one. The Continental Association, this was adopted on October 20th, 1774. It was the first Continental Congress's boldest attempt to force Britain to repeal the coercive acts without resorting to war. Remember those acts from the last episode we talked about. The Continental Association, it was this sweeping continent-wide economic resistance program, non-importation, non-consumption, non-exportation, and it was designed to use commercial pressure to make Parliament back down. Delegates hoped that a united boycott would actually strike at British merchants, who would in turn pressure Parliament to change the course. So to enforce the boycott, and this is what's significant, to enforce the boycott, the Congress ordered every colony to establish a committee or committees of inspection in each of these colonies. Local bodies that were empowered to monitor merchants, publish the name of violators, and ensure that neighbors complied. Now, these committees became grassroots engines of revolutionary discipline. They inspected shops, they seized prohibited goods, they pressured reluctant colonists to join the cause, and some towns, they interrogated suspected offenders. They organized public shaming rituals and ostracized those who continued to buy or sell British products. Now, I describe all of this, and we still think of it with this halo effect of the American Revolution's mythology. I'm betting we do. I did anyway. But if you were a target, if you were a victim of these committees of inspection, it was a different matter. Think about that. Subtract our mythology from the whole story, and you have an organization right here in these committees of inspection that's real similar to how the mafia used to work, or even how the Chinese Cultural Revolution worked. Now, don't take my words for it. Let me just read again from the historian Alan Taylor. This is in his book, or from his book, American Revolutions. He writes, to enforce the Continental Association, Congress urged every county, city, and town to elect a committee of inspection. These committees were to publish the names of violations so that all such foes to the rights of British America may be publicly known and universally condemned as the enemies of American liberty, and thenceforth we will break off all dealings with him or her. Such ostracism could ruin a person socially and economically. By sponsoring committees answerable to Congress rather than the empire, the Continental Association accelerated the collapse of colonial government. Now, there were positive ends, too. People weren't just outed as opponents of liberty. The Continental Association opened up jobs. It was broadening opportunities for people in the lower classes of society to get in on the ground floor of this newly forming government and society. And the way to advance within that society was to be radical and to be extreme against anyone who opposed it. Again, I'm going to quote from Taylor's book. He wrote, becoming the de facto local governments, the committees took over collecting taxes and managing the militia. Many committees even forced price controls, inspected merchants' books, and shunned violators until they publicly confessed and mended their ways. Under the traditional social order where men of wealth and prestige exercised public authority and commanded deference from their neighbors, that pattern became more complicated under the association, where support for the Patriots trumped traditional prestige. A gentleman still received deference if he endorsed the Continental Association, but opponents received disrespect and violence. The new weight given to the ideology challenged a traditional culture that had conceived of social and political hierarchies as interlocked. Going door to door, committeemen urged every man and woman to sign the association or suffer the consequences, inviting everyone to spy on their neighbors. The committees ferreted out, seized, and burned stashes of tea and conservative books while a crowd gathered at the county courthouse to hoot at the culprits. After confessing, the suspects had to ignite the condemned items in festive bonfires that rallied public support for the new committees and intimidated the wavering. Shaming and shunning usually sufficed in the intimate communities of colonial America, so only the most persistent and vocal conservatives suffered violence. In Connecticut, Dr. Abner Beebe continued to deride Congress, so a mob seized him. According to a friend, Beebe was stripped naked and hot pitch was poured upon him, which blistered his skin. He was then carried to a hog sty and rubbed over with hog's dung. They threw the hog's dung in his face and rammed some of it down his throat. His house was attacked, his windows broken, acting in the name of liberty. The committee's suppressed speech by the critics. The Philadelphia Committee insisted that no person has the right to the protection of a community or society he wishes to destroy by speeches and writings which aid and assist our enemies. Patriots broke open mail to read letters from suspected critics of Congress. A merchant begged his correspondents to censor their words from the temper of the people is such that misconstructions are put on the most innocent expressions by those who call themselves the asserters of American freedom. It's a long quote, but I think it's important to grasp what the history books are saying was actually going on here. The middle ground in the struggle was being erased. The Continental Congress built its legitimacy through a philosophy: those who are not for us are against us. That was the mentality. This is a pattern incredibly resonant to nearly every radical and violent revolution since then. It could even be argued that there are times we can even see some of it in our own polarized political age today, from both sides of the political spectrum, to be honest with you. Moderates were disappearing in 1774 and 1775 as the Continental Association spread its influence across the colonies. Many who may have considered themselves moderates before this, they began drifting into the loyalist camp. They may have opposed taxation without representation. They may have opposed the intolerable acts, but they saw what the patriots, inspired by the First Continental Congress, doing as far more tyrannical and dangerous. There was this one guy, a famous conservative, he wrote a friend during this time. He says, "What think of you, this land of liberty where a man's property is at the mercy of anyone who will lead the mob?" The First Continental Congress, most of the delegates at least, truly did imagine their boycotts and their declarations before Parliament and the King would turn back the tide. All right, they thought this would work. They thought this pressure put on Britain, the economic pressures, the social pressures put on Britain, that it would work, that it would restore reason between them and their rulers. Well, they couldn't have been more wrong. The British people and the Parliament were outraged. The King turned his back on their proclamation, and by late 1774, the colonists had formed the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and they seized control of the countryside and began stockpiling weapons. Well, Britain responded by declaring Massachusetts in a state of rebellion in February of 1775. Now, under martial law, the British general overseeing Boston, his name was General Gage, he received secret orders to seize and destroy colonial military supplies stored in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. So on the night of April 18th, 1775, he dispatched roughly 700 British regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to carry out that mission. But, and this is the famous part that most of us know, Patriot intelligence networks, they were already in motion. Writers like Paul Revere, the guy who had made the sketch of the Boston Massacre, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, they fanned out across the countryside, warning local militias that the British regulars, were on the march. The British are coming, right? One if by land, two if by sea. They're sending this message out. The next day at dawn, April 19th, the British column reached Lexington Green, where about 77 militiamen under Captain John Parker stood facing them. A shot, now its origins are still unknown, right? History doesn't record who fired the shot, but it cracked through the morning air, a gunshot, triggering the first exchange of gunfire. The American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, later, half a century later, he described this opening gunfire as the shot heard round the world. Well, it wasn't really. Both sides still didn't quite yet realize this was the beginning of a war, of a military revolution. 8 colonists were killed at Lexington, and the militia dispersed. The British then pressed on to Concord, only to find most of the colonial supplies there had already been moved. At Northbridge, roughly 320 to 400 militiamen confronted a British detachment, forcing them to retreat. The march back to Boston turned into a running battle. Militia companies fired from stone walls, trees, from behind houses, inflicting heavy casualties. And by day's end, the British had suffered 273 casualties, while the Americans had lost 95. The colonists had their answer regarding how the king, would respond to their demands. And so a Second Continental Congress was therefore necessary. Now, before that could happen, though, before it occurred, in the summer of 1776, something honestly totally unexpected by both sides took shape. A previously unknown man by the name of Thomas Paine, he wrote and published a pamphlet that finally set the course of the American mind toward independence. Now, Thomas Paine was born in 1737 in England. He was the son of a Quaker. His father was actually a women's underwear maker whose modest trade, in the end, offered little stability. Paine's early life was marked, common theme here, was that we see among the founding fathers, this revolutionary generation. It was marked by struggle. He received only a basic education before apprenticing under his father, but he found the work tedious, and he drifted through life in a series of unsatisfying jobs. He was a corset maker, a sailor, an excise officer, a school teacher. His first marriage actually ended tragically with his first wife's death in childbirth. His second marriage collapsed under financial strain, and by his late 30s, Paine was dismissed from the excise service and facing bankruptcy, a 3-time loser by this point. But this guy possessed a really restless intellect, a fierce moral imagination. He was also a product of the electric ideas of the times he lived within. In London, he mingled with reformers and scientists, including this guy named Benjamin Franklin, who recognized Thomas Paine's potential. So Ben Franklin encouraged Thomas Paine to seek a new beginning, give up on the path his life was taking for the 3rd-time loser status, but go to the Americas. Go to America. He even provided him letters of introduction. Paine arrived in Philadelphia in 1774. He was actually bedridden. He was so sick from the voyage crossing, they had to carry him off the boat on a bed. He had a fever, but the guy's determined to start over. America transformed him. He quickly found work as the editor of the Pennsylvania magazine, where his essays attacked slavery. They defended workers. They criticized monarchy with a boldness unusual for the colonies. And Paine absorbed the rising revolutionary mood and sharpened it with his own radical clarity. He believed the imperial crisis was not merely a dispute over taxes, but it was a historical struggle between natural rights and the old idea of hereditary tyranny under kings and monarchies. By late 1775, as war was erupting, Paine concluded that reconciliation with Britain, it was impossible. It wasn't going to happen. And he began writing this pamphlet called Common Sense. Common Sense was a blistering argument for full independence written in plain, urgent language for ordinary people to see. When it appeared in January 1776, Thomas Paine, once a failed English tradesman, became the most influential political voice in America. At first, it was published anonymously. And Common Sense was this revolutionary lightning bolt, clear, fierce, impossible to ignore. Its power came from Paine's ability to translate complex political theory into plain emotional language that ordinary colonists could grasp instantly. Men like John Adams and other great leaders and thinkers in the independence movement, they often referenced, when they would write about it, they would reference like Latin text and famous Greek or Roman figures of history. But Thomas Paine abandoned all of that. He used stories and language that the common people understood. He talked about stories from the Bible. Now, this is a bit ironic because when we learn about the end of Thomas Paine's life in a story later on in this series, you'll see why it's ironic that he's using the Bible to describe things here. At a moment when many Americans still hoped for some kind of reconciliation with Britain, Thomas Paine shattered the illusion. He argued that monarchy was corrupt by nature, that hereditary rule violated natural equality, and that America's destiny was independence, not submission. He used everyday metaphors, parents and children, houses and islands, to show that it was absurd for a small island to rule a vast continent like North America. His writing was urgent, it was moral, it was direct, it was appealing not just to the mind, but to the conscience. And Paine also reframed the conflict. Instead of a dispute over taxes, Thomas Paine cast it in his book, or his pamphlet, Common Sense. He cast it as a global struggle between liberty and tyranny. If you're not for us, you're against us. If you're not on our side, you're on the other side. And he insisted that America, once this was done, if they did it right, America could become a refuge for freedom and a model for the world. Well, this moral vision electrified readers. I'm quoting here from Pauline Myers' book, American Scripture. She writes, Paine promised, however, that by eliminating monarchy and hereditary rule and founding government entirely on popular choice, the Americans could form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth, one free of errors that had dogged mankind for centuries. We have it in our power to begin the world anew, he wrote, and what the Americans did would affect the future of all mankind. Within months, Common Sense sold more copies than any previous American publication. It unified public opinion, emboldened the Continental Congress, and helped push the colonies decisively towards declaring independence. If you're enjoying this series on how the world works and the study of international relations, I think listeners out there who are liking this will really love a recent book I wrote entitled Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics. If you've ever wondered how a person of faith is supposed to engage with our crazy political environment today, this is the book for you. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat. This is a biblical-based perspective of how politics works, and more importantly, how Christians ought to work within that system, and sometimes even against that system. We look at everything from our present political context to the history, the mistakes of the Christian right in America, and we'll bring it all home with some insight on how we, the Christian church, can best engage today. The book is Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics by me, J.B. Shreve. You can find links for it at the website, theendofhistory.net, or you can go directly to Amazon and just drop it in your shopping cart. That's Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics by J.B. Shreve. So the Second Continental Congress convened on May 10th, 1775, back in Philadelphia, just 3 weeks after the gunfire that had taken shape at Lexington and Concord. That gunfire had turned political tension now into open war. Delegates from 12 colonies arrived knowing the crisis had already passed the point of petitions and symbolic protest. So British troops under General Thomas Gage, they were now occupying Boston, skirmishing with militia, and they were preparing for larger operations. Parliament had refused to repeal the Coercive Acts. They had ignored colonial positions. They had declared Massachusetts to be an open rebellion. So the Congress met in an atmosphere. This new Congress, this new Second Continental Congress, met in an atmosphere of urgency. The colonies had no unified military structure, no central command. They didn't have a strategy in place, no coordinated strategy. So one of Congress's first major responsibilities, major acts, was to assume the role of a de facto national government, taking responsibility for directing the war effort. And that's how it happened. That's how they became legitimate. That's how they became credible. Just one thing after another, and now here they are, the point of no return, they have to do it. The mood across the colonies was conflicted, but it was hardening. Many still hoped for some kind of reconciliation. Congress even issued the olive branch petition to the king. But the bloodshed in Massachusetts convinced others that independence was becoming inevitable. The colonies were mobilizing militias, seizing local control, preparing for a long struggle, and the Second Continental Congress would be the focal point of the revolution from here on out. Even without declaring independence for another year, the new Continental Congress began to act as leaders of sovereign nations. Now, I say nations, plural there, okay? They didn't see themselves as one nation, not yet. They were 13 different nations joining together as one for the cause of whatever was about to happen. They had no revenue, they had no national bank, no army, no real way to challenge the world's most powerful empire at this time. The British population of 11 million greatly outnumbered the colonists on the mainland, which numbered around 2.5 million. A fifth of those were slaves, most likely to support the British in their own hopes for freedom instead of the Americans who, confoundedly, refused to consider such a policy of freeing the slaves if they would fight. Early on, by June of the Second Continental Congress's convening, they determined to begin building an army. Different colonies began to recruit troops aimed at reinforcing those in New England. George Washington was made again commander of the army. He was the only delegates who wore a military uniform to the convention. As a kind of a subtle way of advertising his interest in the job, right? But the delegates needed Virginia on their side. The delegates knew it couldn't be just Boston, couldn't be just England or New England. They needed Virginia, the largest colony. It was the largest, most populous, most powerful colony of the 13 colonies. So as Washington, now a general, this guy from Virginia, now a general, left Philadelphia to head north and begin building the Continental Army, he left with a pretty big mixture of contradictions. One, he was traveling with slaves, all right? These people who were fighting for freedom, he's traveling with slaves. He privately denounced common New Englanders as the guys he was leading in the fight as an exceedingly dirty and nasty people with an unaccountable kind of stupidity. That's his quote. These were the seeds of his newly forming army. When he arrived in New York, the Patriots, they really faced a logistical nightmare. He was greeted by cheering mobs and then moved off the street and swapped out with the loyalist crowds when the British governor arrived at the port and that mob began cheering him on. So soon the Americans learned that the British king, this was significant, he had hired Hessian mercenaries from the German principalities to fight in America. Now this move was a major blow to colonists who still hoped for some kind of reconciliation. The mother country was literally hiring foreigners to attack and kill her own people. That's the way they saw it. Surely this was now proof to the talk of conspirators like Samuel Adams and others who said the king and parliament meant to enslave the Americans. John Adams noted that this policy made independence practically inevitable by this point. So as the message of common sense, Thomas Paine's common sense, saturated popular society, as the British occupied Boston and unloaded thousands upon thousands of new troops crossing the oceans for the fight, the drive towards independence was certainly moving towards a sense of inevitability. And at long last, the fight was wasn't merely the colonists against the Parliament, but the colonists, the Americans, against the British king, who they finally realized, or they felt, had betrayed them and turned on them. The Continental Congress had already begun soliciting the French for a possible alliance. If it was, really getting an alliance with the French was seen as the only hope they had of even possibly defeating the British. The French ambassador made it clear there was no chance of an alliance until the Americans at least declared independence collectively. In the spring of 1776, largely in response to the common sense craze sweeping the land, the Congress encouraged each colony to begin considering independence. Hey, here's a thought. Let's start considering this idea, right? It was discussed in Virginia and Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, throughout the colonies. Different representative bodies debated and made their own declarations of independence. Each colony did, one at a time. And finally, in June 1776, the Congress determined to make their own collective declaration. So a small committee that consisted of John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and this little guy, Thomas Jefferson, they were given the task of developing this Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had a bit of a reputation as a quality writer for some of the important documents that he had already penned, already authored in his home state of Virginia. Now, Ben Franklin was the most obvious choice. He was the most famous of the group. But Franklin had said that he had made a personal vow never to write a document that would have to be approved or edited by a committee. Adams was certainly capable, but he deferred to Jefferson. Now, John Adams had already called for independence in the meetings themselves. In his mind, that was the important part, just calling for independence, not the document that declared it. none of them really regarded the assignment as particularly important. The document was completed. Jefferson completed the document. It was brought back to the Congress where it was debated, edited, altered, and finally agreed upon. And on July 2nd, 1776, 12 delegations representing 12 of the colonies voted for independence. New York had abstained at first, but they changed their vote a week later for the sake of unanimity. Now, the Declaration of Independence is a strange historical document. The bulk of it, if you've ever read it, the bulk of it is about the complaints of the colonies that they have against their king. There's 27 complaints. Hardly anyone in America even remembers those complaints today, even though that's what the document itself actually is. It's a list of complaints. The part that most remember, if you've read it, is the preamble. This is the famous part. This is the part that's quoted by other revolutionaries in other lands in the decades and centuries since then. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." And there it was, the culmination of all the philosophies of the Enlightenment that had seeped into the American soul, the effects of the British neglect and mismanagement of their colonies for over a century, the Puritan spirit, the challenge to authority brought about during the Great Awakening, the works of Sam Adams and Thomas Paine and other radicals who used ideas to stir the colonies towards a cause that was now to be paid for in blood and tears. The ideas had been birthed, the words had been spoken, and now the actions would have to take place. Now, there was an initial surge of celebration throughout the colonies as word of the Declaration became known, as it spread. Early on, it was the grievances against the king that were most important in these documents as people read them, as they were read aloud in town squares. When read in public squares, patriots would often react and they would attack symbols of the monarchy. They would tear down statues. They would burn royal portraits. In some instances, angry mobs attacked Anglican ministers associated with England. It was the news of independence, not the document and the Declaration of Independence, that was being celebrated and reacted to. For many years, the document was simply kind of like a footnote to history. It wasn't until decades later that the document, the Declaration of Independence, began to be revisited and revitalized as a key piece of the American soul, an article for American scripture that spoke of the morality of liberty. Nearly half a century later, as many of the Founding Fathers' generation had died, there was only Thomas Jefferson and John Adams who remained alive. Now, they both died in 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 50 years to the day, in fact. It was then that historians began to call back on the revolutionary generation and rediscovered the Declaration of Independence and the great words that Jefferson had written, particularly in the preamble, right? The complaints became less important and the preamble started to ascend as important. These historians, even Jefferson himself, began to use words like reverence and sacred and holy to describe the text that declared America's independence. In fact, religious terminology and language increasingly began to combine the stories of America's founding and independence in these years as Americans celebrated its first half century of existence. Now, I've already quoted from it several times in this episode, but Pauline Maier writes about this phenomenon in her book on the Declaration of Independence, American Scripture. Phenomenal book. I highly recommend if you're interested in a deeper dive on this topic. This is what she writes. She writes, "Jefferson became a Christ-like figure whose disembodied spirit was upborne by the blessings of 10 millions of freemen." There's lots of quotes in this passage here that I'm reading because she's quoting what people are saying about these guys at the 50-year mark of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson became a Christ-like figure whose disembodied spirit was upborne by the blessings of 10 millions of freemen and a fanciful 4th of July ascension. Or was he a saint like Washington, whose death nearly 3 decades earlier had left an admiring world to canonize his memory? Jefferson and Adams were exalted individuals who had long since ceased to be regarded by the nation or by the world at large as living characters. The estimation in which they have been held for the last 10 years, as one eulogist put it when they died, has partaken more of a posthumous veneration than of contemporary respect. Men did not wait for death to sanctify their names. Their homes became the shrines to which the lovers of liberty and the admirers of genius from every land devoutly made his pilgrimage. Speakers referred to the altar of freedom, raised by the country's fathers to the sacred fire that lighted upon it to the sacred principles, solemnly inscribed upon the banner of the Revolution and still borne aloft by the strength of increasing millions. Adams won credit as the bold and eloquent debater in the Continental Congress who urged and defended the measure with the fate of empires. But Jefferson was the unequaled skill which embodied the principles of liberty and the language of inspiration as an eternal monument and landmark for the guidance of posterity. The generations that discovered the holy greatness was ready and willing to congratulate itself on that achievement. And so, the stories of the American independence ascended into a mythology and a new language of the sacred. To this day, many Americans mistake words of America's founders as scripture. All men are created equal. God helps those who help themselves. These are the words of Jefferson and Franklin, not of the Bible. But within half a century, the story of America was taking on a religious mythology. And that was important to the story of the empire that we're telling. We're going to continue forward with our story of the American Revolution in the next several episodes. But it's important to see the reality of America's founding right here. Its original birth date of independence. Every nation tries to find itself special in the eyes of God. But as time goes by, it's easy to cover one layer of myth over another layer so that the facts and the truth are difficult to separate, difficult to identify. The religious language that came to define America's founding was still to be discovered at the time of independence. The man who wrote, "All men who are created equal," was a slave owner and one who repulsed at the eyes of God and the thought of God, and he repulsed at the Bible as superstition. As we're going to see, these were significant contradictions within the seeds of America's founding and the revolution itself. The birth of America was the best that could be done at the time, but even the best was not quite the standard that many believe when they rely more on the mythology of history than the facts and the truth. I'm J.B. Shreve with The End of History, where we help believers understand the chaos of the times we live in with intelligent, fact-based, biblical-based perspectives of those times, as well as the history that helped shape those times. We'll be back soon with another episode in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.